My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington. I'd like, on behalf of my colleagues at the center, to welcome every one of you to this special briefing on the Nakba at 70, Palestinian rights, refugees, and the prospects for just peace. This year, as all of you know, marks the 70th anniversary of the Nakba, known in Arabic as the catastrophe. And frankly, if you allow me just to make a couple of personal remarks, it's very difficult to find a word for these types of historical developments like the Nakba that really kind of reflects or fulfills the full kind of diverse dimensions of this catastrophe per se. And my wife always jokes about my birthday, which happens to be tomorrow. She always says, "You're the only person that celebrates his birthday with the Nakba of his people," the catastrophe of his people. But I think it frankly gives it a personal dimension, having been born right in the middle of the conflict in 1948. I was actually 5 or 6 days old when Israel's independence was declared, and the displacement, dispossession, and the dispersion of the Palestinian people started, and we haven't been the same. So when you talk about the meaning of the Nakba, for me it has a personal meaning because frankly my whole life from day one has been in a way focused on this crisis and what it means for me personally and for my people. As you will know, immediately after the establishment of the State of Israel, about 750,000, some people say a little less, some people say a little more, but the estimate, generally speaking, is of 750,000 Palestinians were made refugees, found themselves outside of Palestine. Hundreds of Palestinian villages, and again, for those of you who are academically involved in this, the range is always an estimate that ranges between 400 to 600 plus villages that have been destroyed as a result of the fighting in 1948. A dozen of massacres have taken place. Some of them were very well known or are very well known today. Some of them were not. And millions of acres of land were basically confiscated arbitrarily from their historic owners, the Palestinians, and contributed basically to the growth of the State of Israel since 1948. Today, the Nakba, with all due respect, hasn't ended. It continues. It's a continuing process, and that's kind of the implications of our title today. It is a memorial day celebrated, if you will, by the Palestinian people, the 12 to 13 million Palestinians worldwide on an annual basis on May 15th. But it's not just like a historic memorial, like our Memorial Day in this country per se, as much as a reminder of this continuous crisis, this continuous Nakba that unfortunately has not ended for most Palestinians. So millions of Palestinians today remain refugees, while other millions live under military occupation. Staff have put together an infographic for you that's in your folder that gives you basically the estimates, the numbers as to where the Palestinians live today worldwide, about 12,370,000 to up to 13 million. And of course, the refugees, as far as organizations, NGOs particularly, that cater to the needs of the refugees, put the number at about 7 million. And the rest, of course, between 4.5 million live in the West Bank and Gaza, and about 1.5 plus million live in Israel itself in its pre-67 borders. So that basically, with a little bit of overlap in terms of refugees, that basically is the current statistics of the Palestinian people. So millions of them, probably about 55% of the Palestinians today find themselves outside historic Palestine, and others live under military occupation, under siege, under basically discrimination, those who live inside Israel itself. So after 70 years, we're still compelled to ask essentially the same questions that we've asked 70 years ago. What are the humanitarian, political, and social implications of Palestinian life under these various forms of Israeli control, colonization, occupation systems, and so on, in terms of the long-term displacement and continuing displacement of the Palestinian people? How are the current upheaval or demonstrations taking place, protests on the borders of Gaza? Do these have any implication at all for the Nakba? What are the future prospects for millions of displaced Palestinian refugees, particularly in terms of their right of return as they define it? And how has U.S. policy contributed to this continued conflict, and what alternative approaches can be taken at this late stage to end the Israeli occupation and ensure Palestinian rights and ultimately a just and lasting peace in the region? We have with us a panel of 4 excellent scholars and speakers on this topic, and we will grant each one about 12 to 13 minutes to make their case, and in order to leave 30 minutes at the end of the program for questions and answers, interacting with you in the audience. We will begin with Ilana Feldman, who's professor of anthropology, history, and international affairs at George Washington University. Full bios are included in your packets. If you need to refer to those later, feel free to do so. I will just simply identify the speakers in the order they will be speaking. Ilana will be followed by Zaha Hassan, who is a Middle East Fellow at New America, and she will be focusing on human rights and having served, if you will, as an advisor, senior advisor to the Palestinian negotiation team, and has focused career-wise on human rights as a lawyer specialized in that topic. Professor Michael Hudson is the Seif Ghobash Professor Emeritus of International Relations and Arab Studies at Georgetown University. He has dedicated his career in a way to the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestine question, and we're delighted that he decided to join us today. And the conversation will conclude with Professor Shibley Telhami, the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. So with that brief introduction, I would cede the microphone right now to Ilana, please.
Thank you. Are these on?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you all, and thank you for the invitation to speak. As an anthropologist, I like to have some visuals to help focus our thinking. I have been, over the past decade or so, been doing research looking at the long Palestinian experience of displacement and the extended humanitarian response to this circumstance as a way to understand both the particular dilemmas, challenges, and limits of long-term humanitarianism, which is a kind of form of intervention that in some sense is self-contradictory, and also to think about the politics of living in these humanitarian conditions, looking at what Palestinians do to make livable lives for themselves and how they make claims for a different future from a humanitarian condition. And my book on this subject is coming out in the fall. If I have time at the end, I'll show you my cover. But to sort of take us back, again, this is, know the sort of processes of displacement. This shows population movements in and out of Palestine around 1948, and the massive displacement of Palestinian refugees produced a geography of dispersion across the Middle East. You probably can't see that clearly, but there are currently 58 Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, West Bank, and Gaza. And on this image, the size of the circle gives you some sense of the population density of those camps. So one of the things that the Nakba did immediately, of course, was to fragment Palestinian society and political community. And Palestinians now live under many different states with different restrictions and opportunities in those different states. It also created a new and very important over the years Palestinian subject and political actor, the refugee. And I think it's very important that we think of refugees not just as suffering subjects, not just as victims of history, but as actors in history. And certainly in the Palestinian community, the refugee as a figure and refugees as populations have been central to Palestinian politics over the last 70 years. The Nakba also produced a range of, but it immediately produced a new institution for governance, service, and care for the Palestinian population, and that is the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, which provides assistance to refugees across all of these fields, these 5 fields of operation. And since 1948, there have been very few things that you can say, institutional things, that are part of the Palestinian experience across the multiple places where people live. Ultimately, there are Palestinian political movements that extend across that, the PLO, Hamas, but UNRWA, from its establishment in 1950, is a consistent presence in Palestinian life, and therefore has been a target of Palestinian political claim-making. Just to say a little bit, I suspect people here probably have a sense of the different circumstances of refugees in these different countries, but very, very briefly, to just highlight in Jordan, the vast majority of Palestinian refugees are citizens of the country, and therefore have a different kind of status than refugees in other places, but they are fraught citizens. It is not an easy relationship. In Syria, until the recent civil war, while Palestinians were not citizens of the country, they essentially had the rights, privileges, and limitations of Syrian citizens in the country in terms of opportunity for education, for employment. Lebanon has gone through dramatic changes over the years. When the PLO was based in the country in the years of the revolution, Lebanon was in some sense the center of Palestinian political community and of Palestinian institutional life and kind of state building. Since the departure of the PLO, Palestinians in Lebanon have been especially vulnerable and constricted in their opportunities. And in the West Bank and Gaza, prior to 1967, the West Bank was part of Jordan, and Palestinian refugees there had the same status essentially as those in the East Bank. Gaza was governed by Egypt, and of course, since 1967, both of those territories have been under Israeli occupation with a kind of double exposure that has involved. In terms of thinking about, and I know that was extremely brief, but we have a lot to cover and very little time. So I want to turn to the question of thinking about long-term humanitarianism and the kinds of challenges that creates. And this is, when you think about what is it to do long-term humanitarianism, it's basically the extension over time of an intervention that is defined as a short-term crisis intervention. And this is not actually something that is unique to the Palestinian case, but the Palestinian instance is one of the most extended examples of a humanitarian involvement in a situation that just goes on, and where the needs transform from crisis to chronic and actually back again as well. And just a there are many ways in which you can see some of the consequences of this long-term displacement. Just one way to do it is to think about the material changes in refugee camps over the years. So when camps were first established, many of them, though not all, looked like this, the sort of classic, I think this is what would constitute a classic image in many people's minds of a refugee camp: tents. In the picture from Shati camp, that tent in the front is being used as a school. But when displacement extends over time, and that doesn't even have to be into decades, just over years, tents are not an adequate way to house people for long periods of time. Some camps were actually constituted out of pre-existing buildings, and in other places, prefab buildings started to be made. And then over the years, of course, the density of refugee camps has increased enormously. This is Dahesha camp in the West Bank, and these are some interior shots from Borj-Barajne in Lebanon. And again, you can see this kind of transformation in pretty much every aspect of both the humanitarian system and the Palestinian experience of living with it, where education has to be transformed to deal with the long term. Healthcare has to be transformed. Also, again, just to point out, this transformation involves a movement. I've been thinking about it in my work as punctuated humanitarianism, because it involves a movement back and forth between crisis moments and kind of an ebbing into chronic need. The moment of Black September in Jordan was one moment where crisis conditions reemerge for the camps. There's massive destruction of many of the refugee camps, and then therefore a need for a kind of crisis-oriented response to that. But one of the things that happens as humanitarianism extends over time is that it has to really confront, organizations and recipients have to confront the limits of humanitarian capacity to deal with these circumstances. There are never enough resources. There is never enough care. The aid is not necessarily adequate to the needs of people. And the long term brings these are challenges that humanitarian organizations face wherever they work, the limits of capacity. But the long term introduces some very specific kinds of challenges into humanitarian practice. So for example, humanitarian agencies and workers see their first responsibility as to save lives and to ease suffering. But when you have 70 years of displacement, you have many people who are dying from causes that are not immediately humanitarian. People die from old age, they suffer the illnesses that go with aging. And how they live and are ill is definitely shaped by their displacement and by the humanitarian condition in which they live. But the fact of these deaths is not a result of an immediate humanitarian crisis. So humanitarian agencies have to struggle with, and it's not a very easy thing to figure out, how do you respond to those kinds of needs within a humanitarian setting? And how do you provide humanitarian care in circumstances where people are not under immediate threat of dying in warfare, but where there's also not very much you can do to improve their lives, as is the case in many refugee camps in Lebanon, for example. And then in these circumstances, and this is something that I want to highlight, Palestinians have, from the very beginning of their displacement, had political claims. I mean, we sometimes think of the moment of displacement as being a moment where people are focused only on survival, and that it's only after several decades and especially after the constitution of Palestinian political movements, that it becomes possible to make political claims. But the archival record and people's memories make clear that people made political claims from the beginning. And those claims have been always of two sorts: near and far. These are some, and for the immediate needs now, and for a better future down the road, for better humanitarian care, and for the opportunity to fight for the right of return. And these are just, give you some people, again, I think are familiar with some of the iconography of Palestinian politics. But I think it's very important to remember, one, the continual presence of political claim-making and the continual presence of political claim-making at multiple levels. A claim to a better life now in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, and a claim to a liberated future down the road. And while those things often seem contradictory, especially to outside observers, for refugees themselves, they have generally lived with and pursued both of those claims at the same time. They make a claim for a right to humanitarianism, and people are very clear that organizations like UNRWA, they do not view as providing charity to them, but they view them as part of an international responsibility for the refugee condition. Oh, excellent. I have more time than I thought. I'll slow down. And again, this is something that you see from the very beginning. This is not just a narrative that has emerged about UNRWA over the years. This is something that refugees from the beginning were insistent that there was a responsibility, an international responsibility, and UNRWA kind of represents that, to care for them. But beyond the question of care, people have also made a claim to what I think about as humanitarian rights, which in general is a kind of contested arena. People often think about humanitarianism as being a field of care and maybe offering protections, but not offering rights. And one thing that I would say is that protection is within the field of international humanitarian law and in relation to some of the conventions, protection is a right that people can expect. It's not all that people might want and need in terms of rights, but it is thought about in rights terms. But another thing that refugees have done over the years is to try to push and expand the sense of what might constitute humanitarian rights, right? What do they have rights to within a humanitarian context? And one of the things that refugees have done is to argue, one, that they have a right to life, where international humanitarian law might actually acknowledge only a right to a proportional death. And they claim a right to political life, where humanitarianism might acknowledge a right to what we think of as bare life, basic life, to survival. People make a claim to a fuller life. And they've worked to link international affirmations of Palestinian rights, such as the right of refugee return, to the obligations of international humanitarian actors. So they put these claims to UNRWA and to other humanitarian organizations. So to live with humanitarianism over the long term, as both provider and recipient, is to regularly confront its limits of possibility, the limits of possibility to provide care, the limits of possibility as a political space, but it is also to regularly go on in the face of those limits. And I think that is one thing that you can see very clearly over the course of these decades is, despite the tremendous challenges, refugees have been active in both making their lives better and in making claims for a better life for themselves. And then I'm going to end by plugging my book, partly because I was talking to somebody about covers. I'm actually very pleased with the cover, which is not always the case with a book that you have coming out, so I wanted to share it with you. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilana. Now for the international legal dimension, Zaha Hassan.
Thank you. Oh, okay. It does work. Thanks for inviting me, Dr. Khalil, and to the Arab Center for allowing me to be a part of the program today. What I wanted to do with my time is to talk a little bit about what the law has to say about the Nakba and the ongoing dispossession of the Palestinian people from their homeland. Though the removal of Palestinians from the land began in earnest by Zionist militia immediately after the UN partition plan in November 1947, it has not ended until today. So I will look at the following 4 questions, hopefully in 12 minutes or less. First, did Israel have the right to artificially create a Jewish majority state in the 78% of historic Palestine that it captured during the 1948 conflict? Second, does Israel have a legal ground to continue to deny Palestinian refugees and internally displaced from the 1948 conflict the right to return and restitution of their property? Third, why is the refugee issue such an important legal matter until today? We often hear that the issue is just a non-starter if we hope to get to a political solution, or that it's just unrealistic for us to expect refugee return. So this is still a very important question for us to ask and to think about. And fourth, what are the positions of the parties on the refugee issue, and to what extent is law involved in thinking about solutions? Okay, so to Israel's artificially creating a Jewish majority in the 78% of historic Palestine that it captured. First, recall that in the UN General Assembly Resolution 181, which is the partition plan, the state of Israel was allocated 55% of the land, though Jews at that time owned about 6% of the land inside Mandate Palestine. In the area allocated to the Jews in the plan, there were at that time 498,000 Jews and 497,000 Arabs, so rough parity almost. So it was a binational state that was envisioned for the Jewish state from the very beginning. Though Zionist leaders had accepted the partition idea, they were not satisfied with this demographic breakdown, and they weren't satisfied with the scope of the territory. And that is why they had prepared a plan known as Plan Delete, or Plan D, to capture more land and to force out as many of the Palestinians from that area as they could. And they did that through the use of massacres and fears of massacres that are now well documented. This despite the fact that the partition plan provided for the protection of the rights of the minorities in each of the states that would be created under the plan. So, does Israel have the right to deny Palestinians return to their homes and property? Again, recall the facts here. As I just mentioned, Palestinian expulsion wasn't something that happened during the fog of war. Their displacement began immediately following the partition resolution in 1947, before a single Arab army had crossed over into mandatory Palestine. And Palestinians continue to be forced out of their homes and off their property even after the State of Israel was created, and even after hostilities ended in 1948 and up until 1952. Two emblematic examples are the villages of Kufr Bir'am and Ikrit, which are Maronite Christian villages near the border with Lebanon, where the Palestinians had already become citizens of the state and were evicted and had their homes aerially bombed by Israel in the 50s to prevent their return. Even those Palestinians who were allowed to stay in Israel, roughly 150,000, 25% of them became internally displaced and lost their homes and property and continue to be denied restitution. So what does international law have to say about all of this? Following the displacement in 1948 of the Palestinian refugees, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution, 194, with the support of the US, by the way, calling for three things. First, the voluntary return of refugees at the earliest practicable date, the restitution of their property or compensation for those choosing not to return, and compensation for loss of or damage to property under the laws of equity. Three important things to know about UN Resolution 194. First is that it represented customary international law at that time, and it remains customary international law today. That means that all states are bound by it in the international system. And that's why return and restitution is provided for in virtually every other peace agreement that we've seen for an end of conflict. And you can think about the Dayton peace agreement for Bosnia-Herzegovina, or the interim agreement for Kosovo, and so many other agreements. They all include return. Voluntary return is the only solution enshrined in international law. There is no international legal right to resettlement, and countries aren't required to provide citizenship and resettlement for refugees. So it's the only one that is guaranteed under law. And Israel's admission to the UN was conditioned upon its acceptance of UN Resolution 194 and other UN resolutions. So why is the resolution of the refugee issue such an important legal matter until today? It is, as Dr. Khalil was talking about, it's the original sin for Palestinians. Displacement and dispossession are the two things that define what it means to be a Palestinian for the last 7 decades. And it is a continuing and growing violation of international law. Every day, the issue remains unresolved. Most Palestinians are refugees, 7 million out of 12 million. And think about Gaza. In pre-1948, there were about 80,000 Palestinians living there. Overnight, that population became 200,000 with the Nakba. And today, there are 2 million people in Gaza, in that same small enclave, and 70% or 75% of those are refugees or their descendants. So it's an issue that isn't going away and that has to be dealt with. And to be a refugee is, as Ilana was saying, to be in a state of perpetual humanitarian crisis. 5 million Palestinian refugees are registered to receive assistance from UNRWA. And statelessness also means perpetual physical insecurity for Palestinians. Think about the Syrian civil war and the repeated displacements of Palestinians there. Think about the Yarmouk refugee camp and the starvation of Palestinians there. The multiple displacements during the Iraq wars, the eviction of Palestinians from Kuwait at the end of the occupation, Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon, and Gaza today. It's an issue that has to be dealt with, and it seems to be in perpetual crisis. And it continues, displacement has continued since 1948. In 1967, 400,000 Palestinians lost their right to live in the West Bank. Half of those were 1948 refugees. At that time, the UN Security Council spoke in UN Resolution 237, which called for the right for the 67 refugees to return. We also see a continuation of the Nakba with the deportations of Palestinians from the occupied territories. We see it in Israel's policies in East Jerusalem. The most obvious is the master plan for Jerusalem, which requires that no more than 40% of the population of the city be non-Jewish. And how does Israel effectuate this policy? By revoking residency permits, denying Palestinian building permits, evicting Palestinians under questionable circumstances, confiscating their property through condemnation powers, and demolishing homes for minor permit violations. And of course, we see Israeli settlement and de facto annexation as another way to displace Palestinians. There are calls today by the Likud party to annex the West Bank. There are Knesset bills calling for annexing parts of the West Bank, excluding Palestinian urban areas. We have Bedouin communities around Jerusalem and those living in Area C, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who could face displacement if these policies that are being promoted now in the Knesset move forward. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and the Occupied Territories has coined a term for all of these policies by Israel. It's called the push factor. The push factor is the policies that are forcing Palestinians off the land even today. So the bottom line, to answer the question posed, is the failure to address the refugee issue under international law has green-lighted further mass displacements of Palestinians from what land remains for the creation of a Palestinian state. So what about calls for solutions to the refugee plight? To what extent do they reflect international requirements? Official bilateral negotiations concerning a final peace agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis didn't begin in earnest until 2000. So what is the Palestinian position? What has it been? It's basically that rights-based approach that I talked about that is outlined in UN Resolution 194. And this is understood as being the only way for a sustainable peace. providing Palestinians with options, including voluntary return and restitution. And what has the Israeli position been? The Israeli position has never accepted or acknowledged responsibility for the Palestinian dispossession. There is no recognition of the applicability of international law. The resettlement in a state of Palestine or a third country is the only option, and definitely no restitution of property is on the table. Israel believes the international community should provide compensation and resettlement options for refugees. During the Taba negotiations in 2002, Israel did propose a 15-year absorption program to facilitate a limited number of Palestinian refugees to Israel. The absorption quota suggested ranged from 25,000 refugees over 3 years to 40,000 over 5 years. That would be less than 1% of the Palestinian population. In Olmert's proposal in 2007, he offered a limited number of refugees to return under family reunification, which would have amounted to 1,000 refugees per year for 5 years, or 5,000 refugees. So this is basically, and just to outline what the Israeli and the Palestinian position has been. Of course, there are other actors in all of this. The Arab countries and the Arab Peace Initiative call for a just resolution referencing UN Resolution 194. But other international actors have been chipping away at the concept of what would be a just solution for Palestinian refugees. I will stop here because I think Michael might have a lot to say about what the U.S. position has been, so I won't go into that so much. And then we'll talk about some of the mechanisms for holding Israel to account outside of a peace agreement, including use of international mechanisms like the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which is a treaty-based body that implements the provisions of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. An interesting development is that the state of Palestine filed a complaint against the state of Israel with the mechanism a couple of weeks ago. And this is the first time any state has filed a complaint against another with the anti-racism body. And of course, it's the first time I think we'll ever see the state of Palestine an opposing a party against the state of Israel in any kind of judicial or quasi-judicial setting. But in that complaint, the state of Palestine, it takes Israel to task for apartheid practices, but and including forced population transfer and maintaining a separate legal system between Israelis and Palestinians inside of the occupied territories. Again, it's limited to the occupied territories, doesn't deal with the refugee issue in general, but it will affect the rights of refugees living inside of the occupied territories, and it will involve having international experts judging whether Israel's practices and treatment of Palestinians inside the occupied territories amounts to apartheid. So it's a very interesting development and something to keep our eyes on as the process moves forward there. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaha. Professor Hudson now will help us transition to look at the U.S. role in the Nakba and particularly U.S. policy vis-a-vis the issue. Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Khalil, for the invitation to speak on this depressing subject. I particularly liked your point and the way you framed, I think, the contours of this meeting, the idea that the Nakba is not over. Nakba is ongoing. And indeed, I think you could expand the timeline of the Nakba both forward from 1948 and also backward. So there are people in this audience, I believe, that have a personal, direct experience of the Nakba. I don't have that, but I got married into the Palestine problem, and my wife's family, members of it, one was killed, one was injured. They were all displaced from West Jerusalem, and so on. And so I came at least secondhand to learn just what a catastrophe this was. My assignment here is to talk about the American role, and I propose to do this in a way by grading the various American presidents who have dealt with this issue. And I think looking backward as well as forward, one would have to say that no American president or American administrations have clean hands when it comes to Palestine. The question really is whose hands are dirtiest. And I have my own opinions about the ones whose hands were dirtiest. Others may agree or disagree. But even if you go back to the apostle of self-determination, who was President Woodrow Wilson, we now know that when he thought of self-determination in the Middle East, he was really enthusiastic about self-determination for European Jews to have a place. And we also know that when the results of the King Crane Commission back there in 1918-19 were presented to President Wilson, they were put on a shelf and nothing was heard about them again because the King Crane recommendations offered at least a certain kind of nuanced understanding of the situation, the rights and wrongs, and so on. And we also know that the American Congress, as early as 1922, endorsed the Balfour Declaration. So what we have going back a long way before 1948 is a stance on the part of the American political establishment, not necessarily all Americans, but on the part of the American political establishment and the attentive publics and the vocal commentators, that the Jewish question had the moral high ground in this particular area. Now, I should say that when it came up finally to the 1940s, the United States, among the outside powers, was not the main one. Of course, it was the British. The British had the mandate over Palestine. And the Americans were sort of playing, as Obama might have said, leading from behind in the mid-1940s. So we come up to the modern list of presidents. And I think one thing I would suggest, it's not exactly good news or a positive point, but I think it's interesting to note that all along the way, there were dissenters in the United States government on the direction that the top political leadership was taking toward endorsing Jewish claims to Palestine. Be that as it may, we know that that these folks and these voices were not decisive in actually shaping American policy. But if you look at President Franklin Roosevelt, who famously made a promise to Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia that the United States would not take a position on Palestine without consulting them first, even Franklin Roosevelt had previously expressed strong support for the Zionist case. And we know, finally, of course, the most famous of the American presidents dealing with this issue is President Harry Truman, that he was strongly influenced and sympathetic to the Zionist cause and showed it decisively, excuse me, by his policies. We find that Truman supported the Zionist cause well before 1948, and then after, as I think we all know, he was quick to endorse the partition plan, and he was ready to support claims for Jewish immigration into Palestine and so forth. It is interesting, though, particularly at that time, that there was a pretty fierce battle inside the U.S. government as to whether this was the right way to go. Was this the right way? Was it in the American interest to support a Jewish state in Palestine? And there were high officials, secretaries, Acheson, Marshall, Secretary of Defense Forrestal, who were not keen on the direction that President Truman was going to take the United States. Excuse me. So we find that Truman was, in a way, the American godfather of the Zionist project. Sorry, got a little water, perhaps. Thank you. But if Truman might be your candidate for the worst American president when it comes to the Nakba, I have to say that from the record that we have, that Truman himself was somewhat ambiguous on the direction of things. He complained in his writings, and his daughter complained in her writings about what they saw as the excessive pressures that the Zionist lobby was putting on the administration. But he complained, but he gave in. Now, you might think that made him the worst, but I think for grading presidents, the worst one is the one that's sitting in the White House right now. Because as far as we know, President Trump has expressed no ambiguity, maybe has not even any knowledge of the other side of the story. And the band of merry men and women around the president seem to be equally ideologically fixated on a version of right-wing expansionist Zionism as articulated by Netanyahu without thinking about much else. So that's why in my list of whose hands are dirtiest, so far I think Trump's are the dirtiest. Truman's might be the second dirtiest. And when we look at the subsequent history, our subsequent presidents, well, on the negative side, in my view, in addition to Truman, we have President Nixon with his consigliere Henry Kissinger, who came to the rescue of Israel in 1973. We have President Johnson, who was far more enthusiastic about Palestine than his immediate predecessor. We have President Reagan, he of the Jordanian option plan, who did not distinguish himself. And then we have President Trump. That's on the sort of the negative side. On the positive side, if you may use the term loosely, we have the case of President Eisenhower, who, as you will remember, rolled back the Israelis in 1956 after the Sinai-Suez War, which was something to make the Israelis do something that they didn't want to do. We have President Kennedy, and during his brief tenure, who at least indicated a kind of a philosophical or ideological sympathy toward liberation movements. He had supported the Algerian liberation movement. He had flirted with the idea of communicating with Gamal Abdel Nasser and so forth. But Kennedy's term, of course, was cut short so soon that perhaps we don't really know what he would have ultimately done. We have Bush the father, who expressed annoyance when he was pushed by the Israel lobby, and for a brief period suspended loan guarantees to Israel. And his Secretary of State, James Baker, put in place one of the only possibly fruitful diplomatic processes, with the Madrid process, after the first Gulf War, and was known not to be a particular friend or particular enthusiast of the Israeli cause. And then you have the president that I think tried the hardest, who's President Carter. And we know about the Camp David Accords. We know about the Egypt-Israel Treaty. We know how hard Carter worked with Sadat and Begin, how the Carter administration tried but did not succeed in bringing Palestinian negotiators into that Camp David process. And of course, we know in Carter's subsequent publications and interviews and so forth that he has expressed a severe criticism of the Israeli project and quite relatively warm support for the Palestinians. We haven't seen anything really like that since. President Clinton came along. Who knows? He might have made a breakthrough with the Oslo Accords if he had paid closer attention to it or had become more personally involved. But in subcontracting the Middle East negotiations to his team of advisors led by Dennis Ross, the momentum in that process, as we know, quickly faded. And even at the end, when the Clinton parameters popped up just weeks, really, before Clinton's term came to an end, that process was short-circuited. Whether Clinton was distracted by the Lewinsky affair or many other non-Middle Eastern issues, I don't know, but it seems pretty clear he never personally threw himself into it. And we know, even though that Clinton and Mrs. Clinton at the time made quite a triumphal visit to Gaza, and Mrs. Clinton famously, I believe, kissed the wife of Yasser Arafat. We also know that when Mrs. Clinton decided to run for the Senate in New York, subsequently, she changed her position pretty much 180 degrees on the Palestinian case. So we have to say that this was possibly would have been a good effort, but didn't work. And then finally, we come to Obama. And I think that while we remember Obama's feud with Netanyahu, and we know that the Obama team was very annoyed with the way the Israelis were behaving and even interfering, we also know that despite the efforts of Secretary Kerry, shuttle diplomacy, and so forth, he seemed, in effect, to be spinning his wheels. He did not seem to have the full attention and engagement of Obama. And of course, we know that nothing really happened. And now we've come to where we are today, and as I indicated at the beginning, so far, at least, maybe the jury is still out on this, but so far, from what we know, one, I think, can say that Trump is the most pro-Zionist, the least understanding or knowledgeable about the Nakba, about the Palestinian case. And we see so far not very much pushback. Is there any good news here? Not much, because if we wanted to go beyond what I've just been talking about, the presidents, we would note, of course, that the whole strategic picture in the Middle East involving great powers and middle powers has changed, and the Palestinian issue has been somewhat pushed to the side, and that's not a good thing for the Palestinians because they depend upon world public opinion to understand the justice of their case. Having said all that, and maybe Shibley will have more to say about this, there does seem to be some indication that within the American public, the clout of the Israel lobby at the level of civil society has declined somewhat, or has at least been seriously challenged by a number of movements, groups, individuals in the Jewish community and outside that were not there before. And I think that's a hopeful sign. But when you look at the top level, the power of the Israel lobby, famously analyzed by Stephen Waltz and John Mearsheimer, seems to be quite unchallenged at the top. So what are we looking at? Maybe a long-term shift in American civil society and American values that will alter the historic framework through which Americans viewed the question of Palestine, going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson, which is that the Zionist case was the morally justifiable case, and possibly even in the American interest. And we don't know much about the other guys. They're not really there. I think that's changing, and so that's the only hopeful note that I can end on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Shibley, your turn.
Well, thanks very much. I know the time is short and there's not much of a discussion time, so I'll try to be brief. I am not going to talk about public opinion actually in the U.S. or even in my opening remarks anything to do with U.S. policy per se. Certainly that's something we could discuss in the conversation. I have a lot to say about it. But what I'd like to do is just take a little bit of a macro look at the cause of the refugees, and particularly the issue of the right of return, how it has evolved over time, not so much from did it get worse or better, although it's gotten worse over time, not only because obviously 70 years of being a refugee in and of itself means it's worse, but also in terms of the prospects of the refugees and the people to whom they have become a priority or less of a priority. And so I want to review that a little bit and then think about it in the context of what's on the table today. Essentially, what if, in fact, everyone reaches the conclusion two states are not possible anymore, at least that they're not even framed as a political objective of leadership? What does it mean for refugee issues and the right of return? So just to remind all of us in historical perspective, if you look at the Palestinian issue right after 48, it was really principally about the right of return. It wasn't about nationalism. It wasn't even about the creation of a state. Yes, it was a zero-sum game with Israel as it defined itself and with Zionism. But in principle, it was the principal question on the table was the return of refugees and the right of return of the refugees to their homes. That has not been only observed in the type of UN resolutions that were passed over the years in that early period, or the Arab stance on this issue, but also in terms of how Palestinians framed their struggle. This was the principal issue. And even, with the rise of Pan-Arabism, Nasser, he is the biggest Arab country, the most important, consequential at the time, making the Palestine issue as the priority for the cause of Arabism. Obviously, the Palestinians were pleased to be subsumed by that in some ways, because on their own they had very little chance of achieving their objective. So in some ways, they rode on the tide of Pan-Arabism, and thus it also undermined the chance of their developing or thinking about their own nationalism. It really doesn't happen till late 60s, after the 67 war, that you have a crystal clear Palestine national movement whose aim is to establish a state that reflects a Palestinian nationalism. Even though the PLO starts in the mid-60s, obviously the big thing that happened in 67 was the occupation of the rest of Palestine, and that it created a kind of an approach of self-reliance by the Palestinians to focus on this area. Now, there are two things that happens when you make nationalism a priority, when you make, ultimately, as happened in the coming years, a statehood your priority. It also diminishes, it means that right of return becomes less of a priority. It means that the refugees become less of a priority. So in some ways, even in terms of political focus and objective, you can look at it short-term, long-term, for sure, but in a way, there was a little bit of a diminishing of the right of return. Not that the right of return ever disappeared, not even now, because no one in the Palestinian leadership or in the public will say Palestinians don't have a right of return. Nobody could take anyone's right of return. But it was thinking about it in the context of settling claims to the right of return in ways that don't necessarily entail return. I mean, this has been the kind of logic that came out of the Palestine national movement. But really, even with that, with the rise of the PLO and the post-67 mobilization of the Palestinians, first in Jordan, then in Lebanon, between 1967 and 1982, the Palestinian leadership was mostly based in the refugee populations, even as they were advocating a cause that was broader, including the establishment of a state ultimately. It was rooted in refugees. It was, in Lebanon particularly, I mean, the PLO was servicing refugees. Initially also in Jordan, it was in the midst of refugees. So what happened in 1982 after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon is that the Palestinian leadership became exiled and in essence detached from the refugee populations. They were all the way out in Tunis. Yes, sure, they had representatives there. They're still mobilizing people, but they're not servicing them. They're not like what they were in Lebanon, a state within a state, where it's not just that they were a national movement, but also really a governing body over refugee populations to provide services. And that obviously led to more ignoring of the refugee population. And with it, then you have the focus on people under occupation, particularly with the rise of the first Intifada in 1987, when people focused mostly on the West Bank and Gaza. And then obviously you have the Oslo Accords, which brings the Palestinian leadership into governing the parts that were under occupation, that is the West Bank and Gaza, and not servicing the refugees outside. And with it also the political agenda of a state in the West Bank and Gaza as the top priority objective, as well as running the affairs of the West Bank and Gaza, meant that refugees were even more ignored outside. And those are obviously, in some cases, the more pressing. Gaza, of course, is an exception to the rule. As everyone has pointed out, 75% of the Gaza population is refugees and their families. and their descendants. So it is particularly unique in that way. But certainly the ones that we see in Lebanon, who are right now in a really horrific conditions, and you see the Syrian refugees entangled also in the Syrian civil war. So in that sense, I think the focus on Palestinian statehood and the Palestinian Authority becoming, because you think it's Palestinian Authority, that's what we're talking about. It's an authority over what? It's an authority over people in the West Bank and Gaza. Not much focus has been placed on that, even though it's been a rhetorical part of the Palestinian cause. The thing I want to just end with here is, so where does that leave us if, in fact, there's a consensus that there's an end of the road on the two-state solution? Or in terms of dealing with what the President Trump is going to put on the table for the Palestinians in the short term. Where does that leave us with the question of the right of return, the question of refugees, and what might happen? And here I see kind of in some ways a bit of a tension. On the one hand, I think if a two-state solution is no longer possible, if the Palestinians are not calling for one state in the West Bank and Gaza, then all they're left with is the principal issues, going back to equality and refugee rights, and that's all they're left with. So in some ways, that might actually focus more on those issues, because those are the principal issues over which they have a strong case, both in terms of legal case, in terms of human rights situation, and in terms of even sympathy globally, including rising sympathy among segments of the American population. But on the practical side, here's the oddity of it, because let's say Palestinians call for equality and maybe even in one state that is equal that would be Israel-Palestine. In realistic terms, the probability that might happen in any foreseeable future is very small. In fact, when you poll, I do polling among Palestinians as well. I've done that over the years. I haven't done that in the last couple of years. But in the polling that we have done, when you ask Palestinians what is likely to happen if the two-state solution is no longer possible, very few people think it will be a one-state solution. In fact, less than 20%, actually almost between 10 and 20% believe there would be a one-state solution. So what do they think would happen? It's between more violence or the status quo. The majority of the Palestinians, between more violence for years to come or the status quo. No one really, even people who want it, don't think it's likely to happen. And if you think about it in practical terms, if there is a one-state solution from the point of view of the Palestinians, if you look at it through Israeli eyes, what is maybe remotely possible, if you're thinking about one-state solution, what is remotely possible is that the Israelis would ultimately annex the West Bank and incorporate the Palestinians as a full citizen. That's not likely, but that is, if there's anything likely, that is the only thing that is likely. Meaning what? Meaning you do find some people on the right of Israeli politics, like the former defense minister Moshe Ahrens, who say we should make Palestinians in the West Bank citizens, and that wouldn't undermine Israel's Jewish majority. But think about this. The two-state solution did something a little bit different, because the two-state solution had a certain promise for the refugees. The idea that even if Israel does not accommodate them, the Palestinians have a right to come back to Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza. If in fact you have Israel even making the West Bank Palestinians citizens, it is improbable that in the context of that equal citizenship, they would allow Palestinians to come back to the West Bank. And with it, it's also improbable that they would want to incorporate Gaza into the Palestinian state. So what we're seeing, therefore, is even from the point of view of the remotely possible and maybe even hopeful There's nothing on the horizon that would lead us to believe that there is a realistic solution on the horizon that would service the desperate needs of the refugees, particularly those who are outside Gaza and the West Bank in the Arab states. And that is not a very good thing to end on. But I think when you're looking at it 70 years later, I think this is a dark period in Palestinian history.
Thank you, Shibley. It's a dark period in Palestinian history. Thank you, Shibley, very much. Thank you to all panelists. We do have a few minutes left for some questions. If you have, just raise your hand. We'll go ahead and pass the microphone because of the time factor. It'll be faster, so let's go ahead and, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, with the president announcing today at 2 p.m. his decision on the Iranian deal, what effect do you think this will have for Palestinian relations moving forward?
Anybody would like to tackle that one? Yeah, the question was, with the president expected to announce at 2 p.m. His position on the Iran nuclear deal, would that impact how would that impact the Palestine question?
If I may, I mean, you know, obviously the question is whether or not it's going to lead to more tension and even ultimately some prospect of war increase. But I think that obviously always takes attention away from the question of Palestine. And not only that, but it plays into this emerging coalition in the Middle East between anti-Iran Arab Gulf states and Israel with the Trump administration into a coalition that obviously trumps the issue of Palestine as a priority. So it's what you discover is that it's more marginalization of the Palestinian question taking place as tensions rise vis-a-vis Iran.
Go ahead.
This is for everyone except for Telhami. You kind of already touched on this in your closing remarks, but what is the possible first step the U.S. and external actors can take in finding a solution restoring rights to Palestinians, hopefully one that has a slightly more optimistic perspective?
Can you repeat that? Because it was a little quiet at the end.
Yeah, it's okay.
The whole thing? I just
Yeah.
said, what is a possible first step the U.S. and external actors can take in finding solutions restoring rights to Palestinians? And I think you kind of touched on it, but perhaps we have a slightly more optimistic perspective.
Okay, some specific steps that outside parties can take to recognize and implement Palestinian rights.
I think we might all have some thoughts on that, and I want to.
Well, I have one thought, which, and this is sort of minimalist, outside actors who have actually, of course, put a lot of material support into supporting Anwar and the refugees and so forth, instead of cutting back, which apparently we want to do, they should increase it. That doesn't address, of course, the fundamental issues, the moral issues and so forth, which I find very, very difficult to imagine Washington taking an interest in. I've often thought that it was a mistake for the European powers to be so self-deprecating over the years when it came to dealing with or participating in Middle East diplomacy. They basically accepted the American demand under several administrations that this is our problem, we'll handle it, and you can help just by providing some money for refugee assistance.
Anybody else? Yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead, Ilana.
I just say I have nothing optimistic to say about what's likely to come from any government, as far as I can see. The spaces for optimism, which Michael sort of gestured to, are more in in public action. And here, I mean, I think the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement is probably the sort of brightest spot on the international horizon in terms of people trying to move outside of the frameworks that have been set up by state actors to ensure that nothing will improve. One can't be too optimistic because there's very limited power there, but that is a space for action, I think.
You know, if I may, just I want to add to just to say that you know, you have to look at it this juncture. What is on the side of the Palestinian? Palestinian leverage is small. Arab leverage is not there. Palestinian question is not a top priority. The biggest asset for the Palestinians is the principle. You know, international law, human rights, international empathy, and solidarity with, anyway, the issues of justice. And in fact, you see that that is kind of the resource even in the U.S. when you look at the rising kind of openness and sympathy with the Palestinian question particularly among young Americans and American Democrats, is really based on this kind of worldview that is egalitarian, that fits into a world where human rights matter, a world where international law matter. We this paradigm that a lot of young people adopt, but different segments of the American public, increasing segments of the American public adopt. And in that sense, I think it is extremely important for the Palestinians to stay faithful to that and build coalitions with that, and not undermine their own case by playing the politics of hate or politics that are self-defeating, or politics that don't link up to those people who's sympathizing with you over principle. Because if you lose principle, you lose everything. That is really the thing that is sustaining the Palestinian issue, and I think you know what I'm talking about.
Said, yeah, sorry, hold on. Zaha,
I was just going to add, because just put the U.S. on the side on this issue of first steps that can be taken. But I do think in the European context, there is a growing willingness among various European countries to really think about differentiation and ways in which they can differentiate Israel from the occupied territories in their dealings. And I'm seeing a lot more of sort of, reaching out to those in the human rights community to try to work on initiatives in that respect. So I think definitely differentiation is an important first step to trying to head off Israeli actions to sort of blur the lines between what is Israel and what is the occupied territories.
Said.
Yes, my name is Seif. I have a very quick question to Zaha on the issue of the ICC, because there seems to be a great deal of confusion. Many Palestinians say that we should take the Israelis to the ICC, as if this is something that can be done easily, but in fact, it's almost impossible to do that. And absent the ICC, how could Palestinians hold Israelis accountable on the international arena for war crimes? And very quickly, nobody talks about the return marches. How are they likely to impact the course of future Palestinian struggle? Thank you.
Just quickly, I didn't hear a piece of what you said about the ICC.
The ICC, there seems to be, a great deal of talk, the Palestinians and all those things. We're going to take the Israelis to the ICC. The Americans are always saying, we will prevent you from joining this institution.
Well, they've already joined, right? And
but the process itself is not that simple.
So I'll just brief you on the process and where we are with that, because,
I mean, from a legal point of view, how would you do this? How would you go about doing that? And if not the ICC, then what other avenues are available for legal action that you could raise?
Yeah. So, the U.S., the Palestinians did submit a declaration to the ICC back in 2015 concerning a couple of things. In East Jerusalem and the West Bank, they brought up the settlement issue and only dealing with the period from when they acceded to the Rome Statute in 2014. And in Gaza, they brought up the issue of the Gaza bombardment and invasion from 2014. So those two issues were brought to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court back in January 2015. The process is that, you know, the prosecutor then decides whether there is a reason to open an investigation and then refer the case to the court for prosecution. So that we're right at this moment still in the process of the prosecutor determining whether the court has jurisdiction. So it's been, you know, over 2 years, and we're still trying to determine whether or not there's jurisdiction to hear the case. But it does deal with Israeli policies in the West Bank settlements, and the prisoner issue was also raised by the Palestinians. And just bear in mind, the ICC deals with natural persons and individual culpability. It doesn't deal with, it's not a claim against the state of Israel as a whole. You have to name defendants and that kind of thing. So that's still processing, and it's proven to be very difficult to have things move in the ICC, but it's still being processed. There are other mechanisms available, and I alluded to one of the mechanisms in the UN, which is this Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and I actually think this is a really bold move by the Palestinians, because it's something that, has been advocated for them to do and to accede to the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination for some time. And there was always a sense that, this was too inflammatory and would be problematic in, the continuing negotiations with Israel. But the fact that they went ahead a couple weeks ago and submitted this complaint against the state of Israel, which is, as I said, going to be talking about issues of apartheid and racial segregation and discrimination in the occupied territories, is no small issue, because it's, it's these bodies, these treaty bodies inside the UN, that their determinations then get fed up to the International Criminal Court, and they get fed up to the International Court of Justice and become the basis for opinions by those courts. So a determination by CERD that Israel's practicing apartheid, or Israel is engaged in racial discrimination, systematic and systemic, is going to be very important if there is going to be a future ICC case brought against particular Israeli officials, or if there is another advisory opinion, for example, in the International Court of Justice, like we saw related to the wall. And then there are other mechanisms in the UN that, not in the UN, but with respect to treaties that Palestine has acceded to and will accede to, that will give it further opportunities to challenge Israeli practices. I think as things worsen on the ground, Palestinians are going to be more bold in utilizing those mechanisms. And I think the fact that they filed this against Israel with CERD is a really big indication that they are getting bold.
Okay, Nizar, and then Mohammed.
Thank you. My question is to Shibley. You alluded to the perspective that people have in Palestine and Israel over what could happen, which is basically that Palestinians would still be under Israeli control, the status quo. What is challenging here is the conspicuous, and you and others have been saying the same thing, that that's probably what's going to happen, but what's conspicuous and absent is a scenario where actually there are many Israelis who believe that they can kick out another set of Palestinians to have a second Nakba, in a situation where in 2011 we didn't think that 500,000 Syrians would be slaughtered and half the population would be displaced. So do you see that if there is a war with Iran, that's a setting where something like a second Nakba would happen? Is there appetite for that in Israel?
Look, it's a tough one. I think that it's improbable for a variety of reasons that a decision like that would be taken out of the blue in Israel. Nonetheless, it's not improbable that if there is an escalation of fighting and things become very intense, that you might have some Israeli officials who might think of that as a possibility. We're not there, but yes, it's something that I don't preclude. And the reason I don't preclude it is, as you suggested, on the face of it, you say, we're in the 21st century, but look at what happened in much of the Middle East. Yes, people don't like it when it happens. We all scream and shout and cry and empathize, and in the end, it's not a top priority. Could it happen? I think that despite the fact that now, in the context of the Arab world, Palestine is not a top priority for any of the rulers. And by the way, Palestine was never a top priority for any of the rulers. I mean, let's just be fair about that. So the question was, the public cared about it. Arab publics cared about Palestine a lot, and historically. And even though it has diminished in importance, it's still important. There's a reservoir of support in the Arab world. Does that translate into rising to the top priorities in a way that would be meaningful? I don't think so. And when you look particularly, if you take this either us or them attitude, either they will destroy us or we'll destroy you. That's something that happens in every conflict. And what we do see in Israeli public opinion polling, the Pew poll 2 years ago that I wrote about in the Washington Post, where you have almost half of the Israelis thinking that Palestinians should be expelled. So you have an openness among the public. It doesn't mean it's going to translate to government that is accommodating of that. I don't think that is something that would quickly happen in any foreseeable future. But I worry about the escalation. But I want to say one more thing about that, because I happen to think, as I said earlier, that it isn't only that the Palestinians must stick to principle. It is they must not be dragged into the politics of hate, because in the end, there are many Israelis who are their allies. Israel itself is a divided country, deeply divided country, just like we are in America, a deeply divided country. Don't let the day determine who you are. We're talking about Michael Hudson was saying Trump is the worst president for the Palestinians. Maybe so. I'm not sure yet. The verdict is not out, but maybe he's right. But, he was preceded by Obama, and he will be probably replaced by someone else. America is divided. Don't be dragged into the politics of hate based on the moment. Keep your doors open with your allies, the reservoir that you have in Israel, in the US, elsewhere around the world, because if you lose that, you're far more vulnerable when conflict emerges.
A quote that's usually attributed to David Ben-Gurion, sometimes you see it attributed to others, but anyway, it's irrelevant as to the person who said it. But in 1948, supposedly, Ben-Gurion said we should do everything possible to prevent them, i.e. Palestinians, from coming back. And he continued, the old shall die and the young shall forget. There are 13.2 million people today that today and this week are basically memorializing this day and proving that, yes, many have died and some have forgotten, but the bulk of the Palestinian people have not forgotten. Thank you for being here today. Appreciate it.